Carl, I want to talk to you now, begin because as no one is looking at this because of Ukraine, because of Iran, what happened in the 12-day war, and of course now with the tariff frenzy. No one's really looking at the Pacific as a theater of war, but the United States is indeed doing this. And I don't know if you've seen the reports about the huge exercises that the U.S. Air Force are about to put on. The Air Force's largest Pacific contingency response exercise is going to go from July 10th to August 8th. It's going to take place in the Pacific, Guam, Hawaii, Japan, international airspace, and it's going to involve 300 aircraft. It specifically is all about China, Carl. There's also exercises happening in Taiwan right now. These specifically name China as the adversary that is being trained against. It's all about combat realism, according to reports. These Haiphong exercises are testing and exercising around a prolonged People's Liberation Army, China's Liberation Army attack. And they're going to be doubled in length this time for 10 days. So, Carl, talk about these exercises, what they reflect, what they mean for this pivot to Asia, which the U.S. is struggling to put sole focus on, given its very overstretched capacity all around the world.
Well, Brian already said, despite all the resource constraint on the U.S. empire, it doesn't mean they will not still attempt to do it, to cause tension and to stir up war. But if you look at where those exercises actually take place, around Guam and Hawaii, Guam is on the second island chain, and Hawaii is on the third island chain. These are well beyond the so-called the first island chain, where U.S. was originally hoped to contain China. I think at this point they have realized that's a fruitless exercise because the entire first island chain is under the range of Chinese missile barrages. So now their idea now they're trying to float the idea. Okay, what if we fight China beyond the Chinese missile range? Let's just park our aircraft carriers very, very far where they can't hit us, and then we put extra fuel tankers on the outside of our F-35 to give them extra range so they can fly to bomb China. This is ridiculous. China is now they just started their production on J-35, their naval carrier-based aircraft, their fifth generation stealth fighter. But China also flew two prototype of their sixth generation stealth fighter. Now, United States sixth generation stealth fighter, the so-called Next Air Dominance, is still at the PowerPoint presentation phase. So, judging by the China's pace of military deployment, they probably will be able to deploy those sixth generation fighters by 2030. So, what does this mean? Well, first of all, that means, contrary to what Washington was saying, there will be no big plans on move on Taiwan before 2030. Because why not wait 2030 when you have even more advantage versus 2027? Now, the Washington, particularly Pentagon, has been floating this idea. Oh, China is going to kick off the Taiwan war anytime now. Back in 2023, the U.S. Admiral says China could kick off the Taiwan war within 2 years. Well, that would be this year, folks. That would be 2025. I mean, we still have 6 months left, but I don't think that's likely. And then later they floated the idea that it's going to be a Taiwan war in 2027. Look, this is not. If a war is going to break out, it will not be initiated by China. If you look at all this investment China is pouring in on the mainland side of the Taiwan Strait, China does not expect there to be a war. But whereas US is getting increasingly desperate because they're the one who realize their time window for stopping China's rise is rapidly diminishing. The whole idea of their floating a 2025 war or 2027 war is because they want to be able to fight China within the US time window. They know, by 2030 it will be hopeless. It will be hopeless for United States try to contain China's power. This is why I remain optimistic. I don't think these noises that U.S. is making will have any material effect on the ground. And because ultimately their war plans, they're still trying to fight Pacific War. They think this is going to be a Pacific War 2.0, right? They know, okay, we know how the playbook played out. We did the island hopping, and then we defeated Japan. But what they don't realize is fundamentally the power of balance have shifted, especially with China being now the manufacturing superpower of the world. Whereas on the other hand, the Wall Street elite has been hollowing out the U.S. manufacturing sector for the last 40 years. The Pentagon admitted itself, China has 200 times the shipbuilding capability than United States. U.S. only have like 3 shipyards that builds for U.S. Navy, whereas any one of China's 7 shipyard is bigger than all U.S. shipyard combined, and so there if a war is to break out, if it will be a Pacific War, but in reverse. United States will be in the position of Imperial Japan in 1941, and China will be in the position of the United States in 1941. That is the power differential in terms of industrial capacity. And that's something that I think even elites in Washington are slowly coming to realize. This is why now Pentagon is proposing a deal where they're going to need help of South Korea and Japan to help United States with a naval buildup. They hollow out the manufacturing so much in United States. Now it's starting to impact the U.S. military industrial complex. And Trump said he wants to bring manufacturing back to U.S. Pentagon already gave up on manufacturing in the United States. There's actually a congressional law that says it forbids to build foreign warships outside the United States. But now they're trying to circumnavigate the U.S. law to go have quote unquote retrofit U.S. ships in South Korea and Japan, because U.S. simply don't have the capability. And this is at the time when Donald Trump is slapping 25% tariff on South Korea and Japan, and Donald Trump slapped 25% tariff on foreign autos and auto parts, and Japan and South Korea is getting hit disproportionately because unlike China, China don't sell any cars in the United States, so this auto tariff doesn't even affect China. Japan and South Korea actually heavily depend on export for their economy, and they heavily depend on the U.S. auto market. So this issue is existential for them, and U.S. cannot hope to fight a war or contain China without looping its vassal states, U.S. and South Korea along, but because they will need forward bases, etc. Like Brian mentioned many times, U.S. is fighting the distance of tyranny to bring resources all the way across the Pacific to fight China. So that's why they desperately need those bases. Yet, what Donald Trump's policy is doing is pushing Japan and South Korea closer toward China. China, South Korea, Japan, and Southeast ASEAN country recently have met together. They're going to form a free trade zone that's going to cover 2 billion people, more than 2 billion people, because China have 1.4 billion people, Southeast Asia have 680 million people, Japan has like 140 million. I don't, South Korea maybe 50. My figure might be rusty, but altogether it's more than 2 billion people. It's going to be huge. It's going to be the world's largest free trade zone, and Donald Trump is a great peacemaker of East Asia. Give that guy a Nobel Peace Prize already. And this is why I remain optimistic about the future. There's actually a article in the foreign former Singapore diplomat Kishore Mubani repeatedly said, please, United States, do not make us to choose between US and China, because we don't want to make that choice. For decades, Southeast Asia loved to be able to have a relationship both with China and United States because they depend on China for their economic growth. But what Kishore is really saying is, if you force us to choose, when the shit hit the fan, we're going to have to choose China. And that's already happening. There's a recent article in the Foreign Affairs magazine says Southeast Asia already starting choosing, because ultimately Southeast Asia economic destiny lies with China. ASEAN is China's largest trade partner right now, replacing United States. And there's a lot of Chinese investment coming to Southeast Asia, whereas United States is offering only sticks, no carrots. Donald Trump is throwing big sticks to everybody. Sanction, tariff. He's not offering any kind of sweetener deal. United States not offering investment into the region. They're not offering helping with the infrastructure project, and those are the things that Southeast Asian nations need. This is why over long term and intermediate term, I'm still fairly optimistic about Taiwan. The Hangguang military exercise is it's a routine military exercise. What's the difference this time is that it's much bigger in scale. But guess what? When it comes to the issue of Taiwan independence, the Taiwan military is dead set against it. They're probably the most the one institution on Taiwan that's most against Taiwan independence. Taiwan independence, that formal Taiwan independence, that would be the trigger for war. And Taiwan military is not up for that. And so despite all these exercises, Taiwan is not going to be the one that's going to be at least the Taiwan military is not going to be the one that fires the first shot, because the expectation in U.S. is that, okay, we're going to build a porcupine strategy in Taiwan. We're going to make Taiwan's devote a larger share of their GDP to the military spending. So when it comes to war with China, those Taiwanese will bleed and die for us, just like the Ukrainians are bleeding and die for us. But even for the most hardcore Taiwan separatists, their goal has always been to make Americans to bleed and die for their independence. So this is why if a war breaks out, most of them will be on a plane, to Irvine, California. So I mean, this is the expectation that some American thinkers think that the Taiwanese is going to take into the hills and fighting guerrilla war. That's completely unrealistic. This is why I am still fairly optimistic that things are going to remain calm. There will be tensions because United States, that's U.S.'s job to continue to stir up tension in the Western Pacific so they can justify the $1 trillion military budget. But I don't see a prospect for like a hot kinetic war breaking out anytime soon.
Yeah, and KJ, we always hear the reasons why there are these drills. It's what China is doing. These drills that are annual, and that Carl was mentioning that are happening on Taiwan. But it's all about China being aggressive. China is doing this. China is doing that. Talk about your reaction to these exercises, where they fit. As Carl said, they come at a time where major U.S. allies in this region, like South Korea and Japan, are being slapped with pretty major tariffs. And the U.S., at least in both rhetoric and now economic policy, is punishing the very countries that they need to lean on for a broader war with China. But as I like to say, it's not, they're not leaning on these countries. They're actually, the U.S. is putting their foot on their neck. So, KJ, your reaction to these exercises and what they reflect?
Well, I think putting, the foot on the neck is pretty standard. It's essentially coercion. They're mostly sticks, not carrots. And I think, from a larger standpoint, you could make the argument, if you want to use business terms, is that China is going long on the global south, whereas the US is shorting. It's shorting the global south. It wants it all to collapse and to engage in war, and that's how it's going to win. Regarding, the Hanguang exercises themselves, I think what's notable in this set of exercises is that very recently, Taiwan has purchased 29 HIMARS missile launchers, and it's received 11 already. And they're actually going to use these in the exercise. This is just one more level of escalation, as opposed to, quote, harpoons or NASAMS or Patriots, which you could ostensibly argue that they have some kind of defensive capacity. The HIMARS are offensive weapons, and you can hit at least 20 mainland cities from Taiwan, major cities like Xiamen, Ningde, Putian, etc. You can hit all of these cities from Taiwan. So this is tremendously escalatory. At the same time, of course, that we know that it's completely foolish. I mean, if we go back to, once again, Iran and Israel, one of the reasons why Iran was able to prevail is simply size. Size matters. Iran is 80 times the size of Israel. Well, the thing is, China is 6 times the size of Iran, and Taiwan, is 1.5 times the size of Israel. In other words, China is over 260 times larger than Taiwan Island. So if it was simply a matter of, firing missiles, then it would completely, there would be no possibility of this having any, effect on China. But what we do have to note is that the U.S. is very, very determined in using Taiwan to trigger a war against China, whether the Taiwanese want it or not, whether the KMT wants it or not, they want to do it. And so, several years ago, the US passed the Taiwan Enhanced Resiliency Act, which is essentially a declaration of war against China. And it has written into its, provisions the idea that they're going to micromanage and micro-audit the Taiwan military. So this is still, the plans are in action, and they're very, very, the momentum is extreme. I don't think that we're going to see this dialed back anytime soon. I'm going to throw a little bit of cold water on the optimism, because I think it's important that we, don't be too buoyed up with optimism. Just really, think of the, the possibilities, the risks involved. I think that the U.S. understands that it is industrially overmatched by China. And we know that in wars, the industrial power always wins. But what they have been doing, as others have pointed out, is that they have been trying to offshore their military industrial supply chain to Korea, of course, to Japan, and also to India. They want India to, build, for example, jet engines, as well as, the electronics. And there are Korean shipyards that have already signed agreements with the United States to fix immediate battle damage to American ships. So these plans are very, very far advanced. They're thinking that, if a ship gets damaged in the Pacific, instead of moving it back to the United States, they're just going to fix it in theater in Korea. And there are a bunch of Korean corporations that are used to working with American corporations. For example, Hyundai, the car maker, was actually a subsidiary, a subcontractor to Brown and Root, or Halliburton, during the Vietnam War. So these relationships exist already, and they're being tweaked and turned and weaponized into very, very specific, concrete preparations for war. I think the other thing to understand is that, the US has this doctrine of different offsets against war. The first offset is that, if your adversary has a conventional advantage, you just use a bigger bomb. This is the first offset. It's mass. If the other adversary gets a big bomb as well, then you use the second offset. The second offset is you use precision, and you knock those bombs out before they can be launched. So this is the entire generation of, cruise missiles and, targeted missiles, etc. Well, if your adversary has precision and mass, then what is your offset? And this is what the US has been preparing over the last decade, which is diffusion and dispersion. That's why they're dispersing all across the first island chain, all across the second island chain, all the way to the third island chain. This is why they're looking for every scrap of asphalt along the island chains and seeing how they can weaponize them. And this is the whole notion of scoot and shoot, etc. So they've been working on using distribution, diffusion, and dispersion, as well as long-range standoff, which ties into that, as well as subsurface warfare, to see if they can offset the kind of natural, geographic, and time advantage that China has. And then here's the kicker, and this is where Karp and Palmer Luckey and all these Peter Thiel come in, is that they also believe that they can use AI to dominate the war field. And that's why they want to have this kind of digital Wolfowitz doctrine over the use of AI. This is all this, sanctions against other countries using DeepSeek and forcing them to use American AI, because they want that kind of Wolfowitz doctrine of AI, because they believe that this is the killer app. This is the thing that will be able to knock out and subjugate all US enemies, in particular China. DeepSeek has thrown that for a loop, but they're still thinking in that way. And then the last piece, and I say that this with great reluctance, but I think it's also important for us to understand, is that currently the Undersecretary of Defensive Policy is Elbridge Colby. Elbridge Colby comes out of the Marathon Institute and the Center for New American Security. And for a decade now, he has been arguing for the use of nukes in war. In particular, let me read you this. He's talking about the deliberate use of nuclear weapons over Taiwan. And he says, before the House Armed Services Committee, the U.S. needs to adapt its nuclear policy and posture and be ready to fight a limited nuclear war more effectively in a situation where the United States, this is in CNAS, in which the United States has lost the conventional advantage, which it already has. U.S. nuclear weapons should play a vital role in bringing a war that the United States and its allies are losing to a tolerable close. And then he talks about the necessity for forward deploying theater nuclear forces, dual capable aircraft, etc. And then if you go on to the RAND website, you'll see that they're teaching their interns, the RAND interns, how to use nukes. So, this is very, very deeply set up, and they're they're really committed to this. And so this is the real danger. They're thinking that they can prevail by using AI and nukes. We can't ignore this.
Yeah, and Brian, I want to get you in here because I know you had a reaction to these particular exercises, particularly from the U.S. Air Force. As many people may assume that because we're criticizing the Trump administration and because Donald Trump is president, that somehow our programs, our analyses are all Trump arrangements and we're only going after Trump. But the point here is that there is a big continuity, even in just these very particular military exercises against China, that spans beyond Trump. So, Brian, your take, your analysis on these exercises, and anything else you want to add to this discussion?
Yes, I I just want to say I used to share Carl's optimism, and in particular about Europe before the special military operation began in 2022. I honestly believed, because all of the signs were there, and it was such an obvious, logical choice for Europe to work its way out from under the US and work more closely with Russia and China. And at that time, they were actually, before 2014, I should say. And then the US overthrew the government in Ukraine. And because the US has already politically captured Europe, that is what the European Union is a layer bureaucracy that is thrown over and smothers European sovereignty. It was able to get all of these countries in line and to work against their own best interests, their individual best interests and Europe's collective best interests, to wage what would become an ever-escalating proxy war against Russia. And I'm almost certain that is what will happen here in the Asia-Pacific region with Japan, with South Korea, the Philippines, the island province of Taiwan, the administration there. They will all get in line, and they will do whatever the U.S. tells them to do, because they are all completely dependent on the U.S. The U.S. will not afford them any other alternative. That is the whole concept of politically capturing a nation in the first place. People have to be very, very, very careful about that. I wish that it was any other way. I had wished Europe would have went in another direction, but I just don't see it at this point. I think KJ brought up a lot of good points about AI. I heard Eric Schmidt, who had formerly been the head of Google, he outright said that whoever wins the AI arms race, their system will dominate the planet, because it will give you such an advantage over everybody else that it doesn't matter what other advantage you have. Whoever develops AI in this manner first will win overall. And so that is why you see so many countries investing so much in AI. And he also talked about nuclear weapons. And here's the thing people have to understand. If there were a war between the US and China, especially China would want to mitigate it as much as possible, just like we see Russia and even Iran. Russia currently in a proxy war against all of NATO. Iran, a temporary pause in the fighting, I guess you could say. But they do not want to continue fighting. If they could have any option to get out of fighting, they will, because they understand they're at the disadvantage. The U.S. is on the other side of the planet trying to destroy their country. Iran really has no way of striking back at the U.S. And even though China has intercontinental ballistic missiles that can strike the U.S., to use them would invite a retaliation by the U.S. China does not have the ability to disable U.S. nuclear deterrence. So they do not want it to escalate to that level. So when people talk about the U.S. using nuclear weapons in a conflict, localized, say, over Taiwan, and people think, well, that's not possible because China will just retaliate. They might not retaliate. And this is what the U.S. counts on. This was the madman theory I think Carl brought up earlier. You're a psychopath running around covered in blood with a knife, and people don't really know what to do with you. And this is how the U.S. is operating. Now, the U.S. Air Force exercises in the Pacific, to get to your question, Danny, sorry to be so long-winded, they are practicing a concept known as agile combat employment. And as KJ said, shoot and scoot. This is something artillery units do. They fire a barrage, and then they know that the counter battery radar of the enemy can see where those rounds came from. So they have to pack everything up and move before the enemy starts firing back at their positions. The U.S. is doing this with their entire Air Force across the Asia-Pacific region. As KJ said, they're looking for every piece of asphalt to weaponize, to turn into air bases, networks and networks of air bases. They can move their planes around, disperse their forces, move from one place to the other, to constantly be moving, to force China to use larger and larger quantities of missiles to try to target and destroy and keep these bases knocked out. And so that's what they're practicing right now. And that, even though this is happening under the Trump administration, and it fits in so perfectly with Trump's policy of confronting and encircling, containing China. But in actuality, this was all developed under the Biden administration. The whole U.S. Marine Corps was reorganized to fight China under the Biden administration. And now, surprise, it's all the pieces are in place for President Trump to now put these pieces in use. When I say continuity of agenda, I'm talking about there is only one single foreign policy, and all you get when you vote in a new president or new members of Congress are different faces telling you sometimes different lies about why nothing is actually changing, making excuses for why we have to do this thing that the Biden administration was doing, even though I said I was going to do the exact opposite of everything the Biden administration did. So it is continuity of agenda. The U.S. wants war with China. People have to understand there's something very deeply rooted here. It is a non-white nation that is surpassing not just the U.S., but all of Western civilization. And to the people who currently run the collective West, coming from generations and generations of racist imperial conquerors, this is unacceptable. This is something they will not accept. And because they're going to be the very, very last people to pay the price for their own actions, they're going to continue pushing this in an extreme direction. Absolutely everyone else on earth will pay for before they do. And this is what's so dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, I think in this case, all points here are true. And I think that's what is, I think, very difficult for some to understand, is that there's both this, if an empire is having difficulty conquering, if it is having difficulty achieving what it sets out to do, then it will go to even more extreme measures in order to get that, which is why people should definitely be paying attention to the nuclear question.